Hi, Peter Letterman at Soundsmith. I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about VTF, or Vertical Tracking Force. Every cartridge has a required vertical tracking force. This is a Soundsmith cartridge. It's actually the VPI Legend. It was a short run of experimental design we did for VPI a long time ago. This one's been sent in for repair. You folks may or may not be aware we're the only company that rebuild all of our own cartridges, and we do it for 20%. We love doing that. We love taking care of our customers and giving them a lot of value on the products they buy from us. So, vertical tracking force, how do you set it? Well, like many things with analog, it's a series of compromises. The vertical tracking force initially depends on what sort of compliance cartridge you have. Is it a high compliance cartridge, a medium compliance cartridge, a low compliance cartridge? Compliance is a really wonderful term, as are a lot of engineering and electronic terms. They are exactly what they sound like. Compliance is the ability to comply. So a high compliance cartridge is one where the cantilever deflects easily. It moves very, very easily. So the cantilever and stylus are sprung very lightly. Medium compliance cartridge, obvious. A low compliance cartridge, the cantilever and stylus assembly are very stiff. Now, why would you make different compliance designs? It's a good question. The high compliance design requires a lot less tracking force than a low compliance design. Obviously, if you have a cantilever and diamond assembly stylus that are sprung very stiffly, you're going to have to press down on it kind of hard to keep it in contact with the groove wall so it doesn't bounce around a lot. Or at very high velocities, loud volumes, again, a lot of tracking force is going to be required to keep it in the groove. One of my favorite demos years ago, I was involved with a company in the 70s. I worked for a gentleman named Richard Majestic of Ram Audio. And we were involved with strain gauge cartridges back then. Soundsmith, my company, currently makes a strain gauge cartridge. Back then, the only strain gauge cartridges were made by Panasonic, Matsushita. And there were a few high-end companies, Ram Audio, owned by Richard Majestic, and a number of other folks, John Iverson and Jeff Rowland, all used the Panasonic cartridge and made their own electronics for the Panasonic cartridge. And it was a wonderful system. And it was a sort of a medium to low compliance system. But it had problems because it wasn't compatible with all tone arms. The strain gauge was developed during an era where the tone arms were fairly low mass because they were designed for high compliance cartridges. And I won't get into cartridge tone arm resonance at the moment, but the strain gauge required a lot more force than some other cartridges. So if you had a really loud passage, there was a tendency to mistrack. And my favorite demo of mistracking was the 1812 Overture, the first digital recording by Telarc. And you'd put the strain gauge on it with a low mass arm, tracking at 2 grams. And it would hit the cannons, and the arm would leave the record and would land over on the label. That was always my favorite demo. So, VTF, vertical tracking force, how much do you use? Well, again, it's a function of the velocity of the groove, which is the volume of signal recorded in the groove, versus the compliance of the cartridge. Again, how much do you use? Well, it's a good question. You want to use enough vertical tracking force so the stylus never leaves the groove wall in a serious way. The last thing you want is the stylus jittering or banging its way down the groove in loud passages, of course, in a very uncontrolled way. Styli always do a dance in the groove in terms of how much time they statistically spend in contact with the groove wall, but you don't want severe mistracking. So from that standpoint, you're always better off tracking a little heavier than a little lighter if you're not certain. Now there are records, test records, which you can get, which have different velocity tracks, or they'll have a swept track that starts at a low or normal type velocity and goes up to, pick a number, plus 12 decibels over the loudest signal typically recorded on a record. That's usually pretty good. The Acoustic Sounds test record has such a track. It's track 1 on side 2. And if your cartridge tracks through that whole first track without distorting, you've probably got enough tracking force. Will it make it through a couple of the Sheffield direct-to-disc recordings where there's some peaks that are kind of out of control? Maybe not. And maybe you want to use those to set your maximum vertical tracking force. But basically, the vertical tracking force should be set so that your stylus does not mistrack under the conditions of your listening. The type of music you listen to, how loud it is, and how well you want that recording to be reproduced.